All right, how you doing, Paul? You're looking great. It's we're here on a Sunday night. We're doing things slightly different. Well, you'll see a few things are slightly different tonight. One being my location. I'll get to that in a second. But we're also going to be doing this like a late night, you know, late like the Tonight Show, right? We're recording on the same night and then posting it live a couple hours later. We'll clean up any real serious mistakes that we make in the meantime. But so the other, so that I thought would be a good way to keep things current, but also allow people to get the podcast a little quicker. The way it has with YouTube Live, sometimes it takes a couple of days. So the other thing you'll notice, it's March break, and I'm off visiting some family, and so I'm here at my brother's place in his office, enjoying the hospitality. So things are changing up a little different. Yeah, March break a relevant factor in your life, Paul?
Is it March break? I
Yeah,
have no idea
exactly.
what that is.
This is how ignorant I am. Like, right? No, you have kids, you should think about March break and what you're going to do. And instead, I've got 3 days of court later in the week because I didn't look ahead and figure out when March break was.
Well, like last night, Friday and yesterday, I spent a lot of time personally emailing probably 800, 900 people, um, alerting them to the book coming out on June 10th.
Well,
Um,
let's alert a lot
and
more people about that.
some of them are reposting it already. I mean, I had one person connected to the Mounties reposted to so many people that another person who's very valuable to me contacted me and said, "Why didn't I get it?" And I said, "Well, you're actually farther down the list. You're coming, but I'm doing these one at a time."
Yeah.
So I know that it's being distributed, and that's good. And the response has been over the top. I would say 98, 99% of the people who responded, and there's quite a few of them. I've only had two people say bad things to me.
Wow.
One was a person who I had to check out who they were,
Yeah.
who told me that you don't come from the Portapique area where and my book is about the Nova Scotia massacres and the ensuing cover up. How dare you try and write about this? We live in this small town, this community. We know what happened, and we don't need you rooting around trying to make money off it. Um, and I said, fine, that's your choice.
Yeah.
You don't have to read it. Go ahead. But the other person who is a family member, the families have been, most of them have been rather antagonistic to any journalist digging around in the story. But this person hit it right out of the park. They told me that they're sick and tired of me and that I'm only in it for the money. And when am I going to stop shilling for the RCMP? This may come as a complete
Wow.
shock to the RCMP that I'm one of their advocates and shills.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, yeah, exactly. Tell that to the RCMP and see what they think. Uh,
yeah, I know. It's
expect the
mind-boggling
reaction to be a
how
bit different.
entrenched people are and how much tunnel vision they have. They can't see the fact that you and I got involved in the investigation of the mass casualty in Nova Scotia in 2020. Not because we were trying to make money. I certainly wasn't. I don't think you were. It was to get to the bottom of it and get justice for the dead
Yeah.
and to find out, what was wrong with the system and the institutions that allowed this massacre to happen. And the next book is an anatomy of the cover up. I am now going to show you as I was talking to someone today. I'm taking you inside the sausage factory to show you how a massive cover up is engineered and how the product is manufactured. And that's what you're going to see in this story.
Yeah. It's amazing. So much of what makes up the cover up was, plainly out in front of us sometimes, right? You just saw it and you're like, And part of it was, of course, just making the whole process as boring as possible at times too, just to make sure not enough people or not the right number of people were paying attention.
Yeah, and I'm quite excited about it now. Like I finished the audio version of the book last week, the first run through.
Well,
Um,
I'm out around I was out around Bears Lake and stopped into Chapters today for a bit, Paul, and I saw 22 Murders up on the shelf, so I was pleased to see that. And I noticed they have a section up front for local authors too. So and I was thinking about this today because there's like a crime section up front. There's a local authors section up front, and then there's just the latest books bestsellers up front too. So your book might be in three or four spots at the front of the Chapters bookstore.
well, funny thing, and I'm not complaining about this. I'm just observing. 22 Murders was a Canadian bestseller. It's continuing to sell 3 years later, now almost 3 years later. It's did very, very well by any standard. Random House was really pleased with it, allowed me to do a second book about the same topic. But in Nova Scotia, in the mainstream and alternative media, the book has never been reported on, never covered. And I'm not even considered a Nova Scotia writer, I think, by Nova Scotia Writers Association, whatever they call it,
Yeah.
because it's such a closed shop and no one wants to hear the story that I'm telling, which is perfectly accurate because it doesn't fit into the official narrative.
Yeah. Well, that's part of it, right? And people make noise about wanting to push back and be antagonistic to the accepted narratives and these kinds of things, but it doesn't actually seem to happen through the official media, at least. That's peculiar. You think the Writers Association, especially, you think they would be a little bit rebellious and want to put somebody who's been successal front and
You
center.
would think, you
Invite
would
you to
think,
speak at an event.
yeah, you would think, but that's not how Nova Scotia operates. And it's a very closed society, and they're afraid of criticism. They're afraid of real sort of reinvention, and politically and socially, it's all very closed. You know, like this.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, you and I are not like that.
No, not at all. So, Paul, we've got a few things that we want to get into. There's an interesting, we've been talking about the Canada-US border, and of course, that issue is front and center in the political discussions of the day. And the other thing we want to talk about for sure is tasering, and there's a few other smaller stories. But before we get into that, Paul, I did a Rogers Brief episode recorded Friday and posted it there yesterday, and it was the featured was this prorogation decision from the federal court saying basically that the prime minister was permitted to ask the governor general to prorogue parliament when she did. Anyway, it was I'm not sure if this is something that interests you, but we're the timing of this show we're doing now is interesting. I mean, okay, so the decision was that it was okay to prorogue. Parliament's not sitting. We're going to get a new prime minister today. Looks like it'll be Mark Carney, and as of the time this is posted, it may already be official. He was certainly way ahead in fundraising with the Liberal leadership. Follow any of this prorogation discussion or any of the machinations in the Liberal leadership?
No, but it's like I still don't think we have a proper leader. I mean, at the end of the day, can you imagine after 10 years or so, Justin Trudeau started to act like a prime minister right at the end when he was going out the door?
Well, we were saying today this it's like when somebody dies, right? Everybody all of a sudden you can't criticize them anymore. Well, he's resigning, he's on his way out the door, and there's all these columns about how it's his finest hour and all this stuff. I have a problem. Okay, so you're a word guy, Paul. What does existential mean?
Existential means right now,
It
like
means
in our lifetime, in our circumstances. So
and
whatever, we have an existential issue. That's what's happening to us right now, and it threatens our existence.
And so the existential threat, this is what I don't like about what the Prime Minister Trudeau was doing recently. Yes, ramping up and bringing people together, I guess, but keeps saying and agreeing that the tariffs from the US are an existential threat. As okay, so in other words, if the if it's an existential threat, that means if it happens, we will cease to exist as a country. That's the plain meaning of that, right? Why would you tell the United States, the president of the United States, if you do this, you're going to destroy our country? Uh, isn't that just telling him you have the power to destroy our country if you just do this simple thing that you're thinking about? Anyway, I wouldn't. I don't like the sort of implied weakness of giving a phrasing it that way. Anyway, lots of other things have been fine, but
Well,
yeah,
it's a good point. Like before we move on, I mean, when years ago, do you remember Andrew Crystal? Andrew Crystal, the talk
yeah,
show host.
I think so.
So he was in Halifax, and he went to Toronto. He sort of had this Crystal Nation who followed him. And Andrew was a wacky guy. He died a couple of years ago of a heart attack while walking down the street in Toronto.
Mm.
But Andrew once said to me, contacted me. We became sort of friends over the years, and he said, "You know who's going to be the next premier of Ontario?" And I said, "Who?" He goes, "Doug Ford." And I'm going, "Oh, geez, Doug Ford."
Yeah,
Oh yeah, Doug Ford, Doug Ford, Doug Ford, and Andrew died. And then after he died, Doug Ford was elected Premier of Ontario.
yeah.
And I thought, oh no, he's there's an article in the New York Times or Washington Post the other day about Doug Ford being the Donald Trump of Canada. And then Doug Ford turns into, I think, the real leader in this because he's
Yeah,
standing up to Trump.
yeah,
And it's not about existential. It's you're threatening my guys, you're bullying me. I'm going to bully you back,
yeah.
and that's exactly what is needed.
I love that about Doug Ford. Like he's saying basically, okay, well, we can cut off your power. How about that? You know?
Yeah, it's a very un-Canadian attitude, but
Yeah.
to let me make it an analogy here.
All right.
The problem with Canadians is that, everyone wants to say sorry and, oh, we're tough guys and, we're lumberjacks. And soon as somebody says boo and threatens to cost them a dime, they run and hide in their wood huts or wood cabins.
Yeah.
Here's an example from my life that sort of informed my thinking and how I do things. So bear with me for about 2 minutes, but I'll
All
explain
right.
it.
Yeah.
Back in high school, in my later years in high school, there was this guy who was a real brute bully on the football team. He was a lineman, fat, ugly, big, and he belonged to some sort of local gang. And he took a disliking to me. He was crazy. People thought he was crazy. I don't want to use his name for his name. You know what I'll call him?
What?
Pig off crazy, Krasnov.
Cross off?
Krasnov.
Okay.
You may see it in print nowadays. The name. So Krasnov, he came. Let it be known that he was after me, and he was a big guy, and bigger than I am now, and I was smaller than I am now back then. And one night he came after me, and I ran like the wind away from him. I was a fast runner back in the day.
Yeah.
And the next night we're going out. My cousin and I are going out to a party, and he comes to pick me up. And as I'm going out, I says, I'm going to change my clothes. So I put on some jeans and a leather jacket, went to the party. I no sooner get out of the car, and Krasnov calls me out. Blanco, get over here. I says, no, you get over here. So he comes over right away. He's obviously going to do something. I try to give him my best punch, my best jab, and I was going to follow through, but he grabbed my arm.
Yeah.
And next thing I know, I'm holding on for dear life. I trip him. He lands on top of me, pounds the top of my head, leaves me cut, gets up. One of his friends goes to attack me again, and somebody comes out of the blue, a guy named Art Crombie, and decks his friend. A week later, I'm at a club in Hamilton, another Friday night. And there was this club called the Club Boogaloo, and it did rhythm and blues. It had the local bands, it had the Toronto bands, Detroit bands, Buffalo bands, sort of the neighborhood bands. We even had like the Minor Birds there. I saw the Minor Birds there when Neil Young was in the Minor Birds with what's his name? Rick. Yeah. I forget the guy from Buffalo went to jail for sex offense. Anyway, great club. We're in
Yeah.
there, and next thing you know, Krasnov comes in with a cast on his hand. Krasnov calls me over, and I think, oh no, he's going to beat me on the head with this cast.
Yeah.
I sit down at the table with him. He goes, okay, let's call a truce. You won fair and square. And what he was saying, he broke his hand on my head.
Oh, jeez.
He accused me of winning the fight. I mean,
Yeah.
I couldn't add again. I couldn't do mathematics after that. But the point is, I stood up to him. Now, Doug Ford is standing up to Trump. Is Trump going to be as smart as Krasnov and admit he lost? No, he'll probably claim a victory,
I know.
but let him claim the victory.
Exactly.
Just stand up to him.
Yeah, that's the way to do it. It's absolutely right. Well, that's a good story. Well, you had a hard head, I guess.
Yeah, well, it worked.
And so staying on the Trump train for a moment because this was a really interesting start. We've been talking about the border, and last week we were talking about it in this terms of the $1.3 billion package that border package that the Canadian government has laid out and done basically to appease the United States, hopefully convince them that the fentanyl crisis is under control. We've got the border under control. Do not put the tariffs in place because of this. Okay. Well, now we talked about that and how really it's not maybe the best place to spend your money. Well, we've got a great example this week, an investigation from CBC who followed these RCMP Black Hawk helicopters, and they followed them from January 17th to February 28th. And for this was an example, the Canadian government didn't have enough helicopters, so they rented these helicopters, spent $5.8 million renting these over that time. But for whatever reason, Paul, the journalists were able to track these helicopters. Uh, not the it did it described in the article how they do it because they have a certain call sign and they have to register their flights or something like that, and so they were able to track them. Well, there were 68 flights of these helicopters, average of 4 hours each, usually, and they can see them going along the border areas. One arrest made during that time, and there's not even in it. I think it was a human trafficking allegation. It wasn't even fentanyl. So there's an example of all right, throw all this money at the border, even though the way to the fentanyl is so tiny and it's made synthetically in labs in country in Canada somewheres. That's where the target should be, but they want us to check the border. Okay, we're checking the border. $5.8 million for one arrest, unrelated.
Okay, first things first. Well, it was actually 5.3 million, but
5.3, yes. Yes.
5.3 million. But the story is a good example of solid journalism the CBC did there.
Yeah.
Like my favorite show on the CBC is Marketplace because they actually do real journalism, in the name of looking out for the consumer. And it's not politicized or anything. They just do good journalism. But this story shows you how journalism should work and how the CBC, when it's doing its job, is doing it better than anyone else and in the public interest. And you've got all these yahoos who say, well, we got to get rid of the CBC and defund the CBC, like Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah.
Doesn't know what he's talking about because our country depends on that kind of reporting and we need it everywhere. And the 5 reporters who did that, they use FlightAware. I use FlightAware every so often because, we get 400 or 600 planes a day flying over our house. And sometimes I want to say, oh, what plane is that? Go on FlightAware. Oh, it's going to Copenhagen. It's going here. It's going there, It's just a fun thing to do, but it does track helicopters. So that's, that big shout out to the CBC for doing that story because that's good basic investigative journalism. Not following the narrative, creating a new narrative.
Yeah.
Second thing, You touched on the very most important thing about it. As we talked about a bit in our first show, the issue about drugs going over the border is not about fentanyl crossing the border like Trump says. The issue is Canada's ports. That's where the problem is.
Yeah.
It's not the land border. It's not people sneaking in Maine. That may happen here and there or across the Great Lakes. It's the board. It's the ports in Vancouver, Montreal, and Halifax, and all the precursors for fentanyl production, for methamphetamine, are coming in those ports, and there is virtually no policing whatsoever. And why is there no policing? Since 1997, when the Chrétien government and Paul Martin said we're going to reduce, we're going to make our country, we're going to balance our budget. What did they do? They got rid of the Ports Canada police, who knew how the ports operated. They were replacing with the RCMP, who don't know their ass from the hole in the horse, and local police who have no resources or no inclination to do it, and basically turned it over to the Hells Angels. So I saw a recent story where there was 27 members of the Hells Angels working at the Vancouver port. What do you think they're doing there?
Oh.
Smuggling in grease for their motorcycles?
Yeah.
They know how everything works. They've infiltrated the Coast Guard and all the other groups, fisheries. So they know what's out on the water, where the patrols are, how to get around them. And there's been no interest in Canada to fix that problem. And because there's no interest in fixing that, they've left an opening to Donald Trump to come in and make accusations against the country, which are partially true, because the country's been asleep at the switch. There's my rant for the day.
No, it's absolutely true. So the money, it's so crazy that huge amount of money is being spent on these things. There's always needs in other areas, and then all of a sudden see this waste. But one of the questions I was thinking about, Paul, is sort of off that. And given your written books about policing, about the RCMP, okay, so this is a difficult sometimes to figure out. Is the fact that there's no crime taking place along the border, did they find nothing because there was nothing to find, or did their presence deter criminals from acting? You can say this about if you're policing a neighborhood, well, and there's no arrests, well, are the police not doing anything, or is it because they're there that they're having a deterrent effect and preventing criminal activity from happening, or deterring it by their heavy police presence?
Well, I think the CBC story answers that.
Yeah.
The CBC story is in their story, they say most of the flights took place in the daytime when they could see things. They're working night. This is a 9 to 5 patrol. I got news for you. The bad guys work at night too. It's if you're going to cross the border, a lot of time darkness helps. That's what I've heard.
By the way, wouldn't it be easier to do that at night? Like during the day, especially in a heavily wooded area, you're gonna have a hard time seeing anything. Whereas at night, at least you're gonna see some lights. You're gonna see something.
That's right. I mean, it's all Wesley Wark from the Center for International Governance Innovation, a think tank in Waterloo, said this is border security theater. It's the same security theater we see going through U.S. airports. Take off your shoes. Do this, do that. Take off your belt. But you're flying in other countries. None of that ever happens because the scanners they have pick up anything anyway. It's like it's just security theater to make it look like they're doing something. A bunch of sort of overweight, undersized people with big guns in U.S. airports enforcing security when the chances of anything being there are so slim as to be negligible.
Yeah.
But the cost is enormous. And they're doing the same thing at the border. security theater. Look what we're doing, all these planes flying back and forth. But what about the ports? The ports
Yeah.
are the big issue.
So strengthening up the ports and then doing some more investigation, like intelligence investigation on these labs, these fentanyl producing labs, seems like the better use of resources.
Oh,
5.3
absolutely.
done
That
nothing.
that's what they should be doing. There are like hundreds of motorcycle puppet clubs now operating in Canada. Why do you think they're there? Just to ride motorcycles around every couple of weeks and go on a run?
Yeah,
No, they're in business. No matter what they say about being part of the community and holding toy drives, their business is drug running, prostitution, the things that are sort of the rot in the fabric of our society. And the sad thing is they have community support in a lot of communities. I know in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, people don't want to say bad things about them. So there's nothing is really being done about them. And the police are sort of up against it. So if you want to blame the police, well, they're being overwhelmed. There's a constant supply of drugs and the precursors for drugs to make drugs coming in that, so they knock off one here and another one there. There's always more. The problem is you've got to stop it at the border. Where's the border? At the ports. That's where it's coming from China. That it's not coming through you know, illegally across the borders. Even the fentanyl is being shipped in. If it does cross the border, it's usually on somebody's body or in a car or whatever.
yeah.
It's not some syrup or in a transport truck. It's not surreptitiously coming across the border.
It's so easy to hide, just given how few things are thoroughly searched.
Yeah.
Uh, all right, Paul. We'll move on to tasers here in a second. Actually, but I just wanted you mentioned the marketplace, one of your favorite shows. Did you see the episode where I was on Marketplace? This was years ago. This is probably my first real television appearance, and it was just a weird coincidence. I was driving home from the airport, had rented or driving home from Halifax in a rental, my now wife and I, and had all season tires in a snowstorm in the winter. And so, anyway, my mother-in-law wrote into Marketplace, how is this possible that you don't get winter tires on a rental? And so Marketplace they came down, interviewed me, did some video of it, did a story on it. So I was on.
I actually remember that story, but I didn't know it was you then because I
Yeah,
didn't know
yeah.
you
Right.
then.
Little did you know, right?
Yeah, I remember that
Coming back
story.
around. So, all right. So another story that came out this week is about tasering in Halifax, and I'll let you introduce it, Paul. But I'm seeing this more and more, and I'll talk about that after you introduce it. But there's a lot more tasering taking place. I had a few, and and now with video onboard cameras and body cam, I'm getting to see a few more taserings in action. So you discuss what's going on here, and then we'll get back into it.
Um, I thought you were going to be discussing it, but I will.
Oh, sorry.
Uh, Essentially, what has happened is that there were two incidents in the last week in Halifax where people were tasered who had mental health crisis during mental health crisis. They were tasered and then they later died. One was a 25-year-old man. 6 days later, a 37-year-old man. They both became aggressive with police officers. Died in custody after being tasered. Um, you look at it and say, why are the police doing this? It's an issue right across North America. It's not just here. But the Halifax case is a good example of why this is happening and why people are dying from it. Do you have any ideas before I
Well,
move on?
so we had the Jacansky case out in Vancouver years ago, and that led to an inquest. But there's a couple of, I mean, I think the main culprit is that people that are being tased in many cases, I think now are on these amphetamine-driven drug compounds, cocaine, and their heart is already elevated, and then they get struck with this these taser prongs with another jolt of electricity, and I think it's just overwhelming for their cardiovascular system, and it just puts them over the edge. We'll see what happens if there's if the medical examiner takes a close look at it, if they're able to even make that kind of an analysis. But I suspect in both of these cases, you're going to find that, and I'm not blaming them for, I don't know enough about the details to say, uh, but I would be pretty surprised if you saw that they did not have some amphetamine based or cocaine based drugs in them.
Oh, absolutely. But you're getting people, the social justice warriors saying, well, why are they sending police to a situation where it's a mental health crisis? And shouldn't they have a social worker there, someone trained to talk people down?
Mm.
Well, that's been tried. I mean, there have been units where a policeman and a social worker are paired together, and they go to a scene and they have to deal with the situation. What has happened historically, I understand, is that sometimes that works, but when it doesn't work, it's a catastrophe. Because if they can't talk the person down and they're armed or have access to weapons or whatever, then backup is needed. And you have to bring police in, hopefully muscular police in,
Yeah.
because an undersized, undertrained sort of police officer doesn't come in and do that kind of job. Well, then what has happened, especially as I understand in Halifax, they had this kind of program. And then what happened then was cops stopped responding to those sort of cases as backup. Very controversial. I've got this from two police officers who said
Yeah.
the issue is people will not go into those situations because they're too dangerous. So then you have the social workers withdrawing from it because social workers, they might be able to talk the talk, but they can't walk the walk if things get violent, nor should they be expected to. But the reality is things get violent and very quickly and very dangerously.
Yeah. Very unpredictably.
Yeah. And then but this addresses another problem in the way policing is being done in municipalities like Halifax right now. There's been pressure, the whole defund the police movement. We're going to make policing better.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it made policing worse. Just the very talk about it and some of the political inroads that were made to sort of soften policing and make it less sort of militaristic. Well, along the way, they've had difficulty recruiting people because of the rules and the onerous rules. And we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
The people on the front lines tend to be big men and they're the ones who get involved in all the scraps and all the violence because it happens because they're there, the bad guys are there, something has to be done. They're held back, others are promoted because they're not involved, they have clean records. But people are then the aggravating factor in here is what happened in Halifax is that politicians changed the rules about what is a long-term disability. So it used to be that long-term disability, you'll think this is an arcane argument, but this is sort of dispersing the fog about what's going on.
Yes.
When cops used to go on long-term disability, it would be financed by the city. But in subsequent years, as they lowered standards for officers, physical and other standards, more and more officers were getting hurt, raising the cost to the city. So the city and the police union agreed to a new formula. They would go into the Workmen's Compensation Board. And under the WCB, a police officer off on long-term disability would receive 70% of their pay. And then the city would make up to 30%, so they'd be made whole
Oh.
while they're off.
Oh, okay.
Well, psychologically, what's happened is, you expect your policemen to be honorable and moral and, upstanding citizens acting in the public interest. Well, a whole bunch of police officers then realized, wait, if I have a doctor's note saying I have a long-term injury or PTSD, I could get paid whole. WCB and the city get paid 100%. I don't have to go back to work.
Freedom 45. Yeah,
And so what you have is last year, Halifax Police Force is what, 570 officers, something in that range. It's
yeah,
not, yeah. 90 officers were off on long-term disability. 90. So you wonder why there's nobody on the street and why these things are happening. The people who are on the street, the honorable ones who are continuing to work, are overwhelmed, stressed out, don't have enough backup, and you've got 90 officers sitting around. I think this year it's 60 right now. That's what I'm told.
okay.
And so you've got 1/10 of the force off on long-term disability sitting around the pool or in Florida or running a business and collecting full pay. And then the aggravating factor is taser training has been reduced to a couple of hours of training, maybe indoor situations, nothing real, nothing live. And the officers are getting on the street. They're overwhelmed, stressed, undertrained, maybe not physically capable of handling themselves. Like in the old day, you get a cop who would say, take someone on physically and deal with it. But, we can't have that happen now because that's violence. Well, and you can't shoot them. And so the
Yeah.
tasers are being whipped out at every instance. And it's not right. I mean, I was talking to a cop the other day. He says, been on the force 17 years. This is a burly guy.
Yeah.
Never used my taser once. He said, but you got some people here, they're like trigger happy. They pull out the taser at the least
Seems like
provocation.
it, right? So I read these police reports all the time, and sometimes you're like, really? You pulled out the taser that quickly? Like, and the situation hadn't escalated, and that escalates the situation, right? You're
Oh,
just talking to
absolutely.
somebody, all of a sudden the taser comes out. It's like, whoa, hang on now.
But you're getting like the politicians who are sitting on the police commission and on city council. They have no clue what's going on. All they want to do is, if somebody starts complaining about police harassment, violence, whatever, we want to make it go away. But the unintended consequence is things like this, where you've got undertrained, physically not capable people who cannot defend themselves. They're scared, and they use their tasers on
Yeah.
anyone.
So you get somebody coming at you. All right, so you're a little undersized, and you don't think you can, you know, wrestle this person or fight the person, so you don't want to take out your gun. The taser comes out very quickly, and all of a sudden it's you better back up, you better, comply. And the person naturally, like these defendants, especially if they're on drugs or they're drinking some, they're like, no, wait, you don't understand, and they're trying to explain, and they're getting closer to the police officer, and the police officer's like, no, back up, and so it can lead to some really unnecessary taserings, right? And they
Well, how crazy, Adam, how crazy it's gotten is, I don't have the story in front of me right now, but we'll may get into it in more detail later. I saw a case the other day where a prisoner in a corrections setting attacked a guard. The guards basically had to fight him down and basically restrain him. And then he sued and was allowed to sue for being beat up by the guards.
yeah, oh yeah,
Like, that's insane. Like we've got all these prison rights advocates and anti-police violence, et cetera, et cetera. They don't understand what the world is really like for the people doing the job. And if we don't allow those people to do the job properly and don't have the proper people doing the job, then the situation gets worse and worse and worse and more expensive. It costs taxpayers more because we don't have the proper people in place and doing the job the way they should be doing it.
Yeah, should be supported more. I mean, it's anyway, it's a tough job, and I've seen cases too where officers are really like, well, you need to use force on this person because they're not complying, and it's like, well, what do you expect, people? You can't just, people aren't just going to be talked down all the time. Sometimes the police need to use force, and all right, if that's the case, that's it. Those are the consequences.
Look, I know growing up, I grew up in a tough neighborhood. And, the cops back then had billy sticks and they would take them out, and you didn't want to get hit by one of those things. So you basically complied.
Yeah,
But, and then when people, cell phone cameras came out and people were seen being hit by them, well, you only saw that side of the story. You don't know, sometimes it was egregious. I agree. But we never see the part where the person incited it and what they did to provoke that
yeah.
situation.
Yeah, I've seen police officers be pretty restrained in the face of antagonizing, accused or onlookers or whoever. Paul, I was just thinking back to you're talking about the politicians in this. You see this story in Halifax this week of Gavin Giles, police commissioner. He's a lawyer at McGuinness Cooper, one of the top litigators in the province, and he took on the role of police commissioner, been on the board, I think, for 3 years, needed to be extended, but then he was, there were so many, it sounded like unfounded or whatever complaints. People didn't like his style, his meeting, chairing style, and so he's out of there. That seems to me like a loss. I don't, I don't have all the back and forth about what led to it, but just knowing Gavin Giles and what kind of a lawyer he is, and he's not afraid to, not afraid to speak his mind. I think that must be a loss to the city for him to be forced out like that.
I don't know him, but I
Yeah,
do know that there's essentially a cabal running policing, and they're running it badly. And there's no way in there because they keep getting reelected, and no one's looking at the situation in policing objectively. That if you look at the policing situation in Halifax, the one thing that makes sense is unify the Halifax police and the RCMP, make one police
yeah,
force for the entire Halifax region. That makes sense. But you're getting people like the police, Becky Kent and Kathy O'Toole, the chief administrator. Uh, oh, but we went out to depot and the RCMP showed us what they're doing, and it's just wonderful. We were so impressed that we got to ride on a horse.
yeah,
These people should not be making decisions.
yeah. No, that was something I saw in the news, and I don't know Gavin Giles that well, but just
Yeah.
it seemed like he was being pushed out by some entrenched interests there.
Oh,
So
absolutely. And I mean, but the problem is getting the public aware of what's going on and doing the right thing. I mean, one of the stories we looked at this week was just briefly referring to it, is in New York, where they've knocked crime down in some areas by 15%. And how did they knock it down? Targeted policing in communities. Programs where they go into the areas where there's the most crime, flood the area with police, make the bad guys stay home or put them in jail. I mean, it makes perfect sense. But if you try to do that in a lot of cities, right away it'll become racial profiling, it'll be unfair practices, targeting, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to get rid of crime, there are strategies to do it that make a lot of sense, but do we have the will to do it? You could do it in Halifax, you could do it in a lot of places. But in New York, they're doing it right now, and it's a pretty interesting program.
read a little bit about that, and I agree. Like how you can see how it would be a delicate issue, right? Okay, well, we're going to target this area of Halifax or this area of Toronto or this area of Montreal. Okay, so, well, what if that happens to coincide with a certain ethnic group? Well, you'll be accused of racially profiling, but I bet you if you did a deeper dive into each of those situations, the ethnic group in question would be pleased to see more policing taking place and, having, I think of this sometimes on the reserves, right? Difficult situations for, kids growing up in those in reserves or in rough neighborhoods, wherever it may be. And, if there were if the streets were safer, if the areas were safer, well, then children are more likely to thrive educationally and every other way. So
Absolutely.
wouldn't the community be in support of that?
No, the communities would be in support of that, but you've always got the squeaky wheels get the most ink, and they're complaining about police violence and profiling, et cetera, et cetera. But the law, most people living in any of these communities are law abiding, and they're afraid to say anything because they know there's no backup, and that the police will come and then go, and then there's no people are put in jail for brief periods of time, come out, they threaten, they do all kinds of things to ruin communities. But we're not dealing with the substantive issue in a qualitative way. And that takes a little courage. I'm dealing in right now in New Brunswick, looking at that very situation where you've got chiefs at various reserves who are pleading for better policing, pleading to keep drug dealers off their reservations, pleading to get the bad apples within their own community kicked out. And then you're getting people in the community saying, but you can't do that because they're part of our community. So you've got to let them be free. Um, if you want a civilized society, you've got to deal with the bad apples. And I don't mean this as some sort of conservative wacko. It's just common sense.
Yeah, it is. And people think, okay, well, it's either one or the other. People treat it as a very simple issue, and it's a complex issue. I mean, you can police a neighborhood that is dominated by one ethnic group, but do it in a way that is not racially motivated or racially, is disproportionate in any way or disrespectful. You can go in and enforce the law, stop a break and enter, stop thefts, show, a police presence that's going to deter some other activity without being a jerk about it, without having police stop people on the streets that are just walking down the streets, minding their own business, being law abiding. You don't need to shake down every person of color that you see. You can just be police officers in the area in a non-racist manner and police. Like it's not as simple as I guess the leftist culture warriors would have you believe.
No, and I think that I'd like to keep following what's going on in New York because a lot of advances in policing over the years have been done in New York.
Hmm.
Los Angeles, New York, where they have like serious issues in their communities, but they're trying to deal with them in a positive way. And from what I've seen so far, what's going on in New York has met positively within the community. They said people can now walk down the streets, and because certain corners that used to be the fiefdoms of this gang or that gang have been taken back by the police,
Yeah.
and pushed them away from lucrative corners, brought enforcement where it has to be brought. But in smaller cities like Halifax and whatever, and they take this namby-pamby approach, and because the politicians are so insecure or they have no real vision for how things should be done. And I think that, it's time for people to wake up. Been said many times before, people won't wake up, but hopefully they might.
So I remember when Andy Fillmore came in as they were talking about budget in Halifax, that he was like, all right, yeah, we have to make cuts, but not to policing. Anything else?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Reorganize policing and you could probably make cuts.
yeah,
If you unify the RCMP and Halifax police, you could probably have cheaper policing in the long run.
yeah, I think so. It's
But before we go, I see
yeah,
we're running out of time here.
yeah,
I want to get back to one thing.
sure.
Wayne Gretzky.
All right, we have another hour.
Well, you're a Wayne Gretzky fan, and I was somewhat critical of Wayne Gretzky and his approach vis-a-vis the situation between Canada and the United States, and his him having to have as I pointed out in the last show, when he played for the Edmonton Oilers, he had Dave Semenko looking after him and Marty McSorley with the LA Kings. Now he has his wife and Donald Trump looking after him because he's not spoken a word about this. And there's been a lot of debate in the Canadian newspapers, even spilled over to American newspapers, about poor Gretzky being, he should be protected. He's a good guy. He gives to charity, et cetera, et cetera. He hasn't sort of spoken up at all. He seems to have lost his tongue. But I'll let you go first, and then I'll finish.
Well, the only development I saw this week, and I should look up to see what's his, remember the guy's name. The member of parliament for the area wrote a letter, and his point was about Gretzky's relationship with Brantford. You would know this, I guess, being from the area. He was basically run out of Brantford in a way at 14 because there was so much pressure on him, all these things. What the MP mentioned was that I think Gretzky's aunt, I think, had a was disabled, and how the family kept her and kept her in the home and didn't send her off to an institution or something like this. So that was ahead of their time. And Walter still mowed lawns into his 70s for the neighborhood. Anyway, and Gretzky himself donated and did all these things for the city of Brantford, even though when he was 14, they sort of forced him out of town because they were putting so much pressure on him. But anyway,
Okay.
I'm still on that train, plus also watching Ovechkin, and he's still 10 goals away. So hope it keeps it that way.
Okay. My take on Gretzky, um, he's been protected his whole life. Sharon, my wife's brother, used to play baseball in the same league with Gretzky, and said he tells us he was the biggest whiner and crier in the whole league
Yeah.
if things didn't go his way. Um,
Well,
I
he got
like
that
that
early in his
story.
career too. I know Don Cherry gave it to him every once in a while.
Well, yeah, you look at the somebody sent me last week. I think Chad Jones sent me when we talked about Gretzky, sent me the hit he took from Bill McCreary. It's on, you can see it on YouTube. Call it up. Bill McCreary, Gretzky. He hit Gretzky. Gretzky was left on the ice crying, and then Bill McCreary played about six more games in the NHL, and then he was gone because you're not allowed to hit Gretzky. But my biggest beef with Gretzky and his image that I left out the last time was that he's in it for the money. Always, since he was 14 years old, it's about the money. And I think he had a good reputation until now, and he ran into this sort of thing with tariffs and his friendship with Donald Trump. But it's what he's doing to make money. His number one way to make money these days,
Yeah.
online gambling.
Oh yeah. I
He's
don't like that.
there marketing online gambling into houses, to children, to ruining sports, turning everything into a
300%.
bet. And when I see people like Gretzky and others doing that to make a quick buck, I think it's
Yeah.
immoral. It's unbecoming of someone who should be an idol, and therefore I am canceling him.
Well, Paul, I've got to agree with you on the gambling side. I don't like that. I did not like that Gretzky did it. I've worn Wayne Gretzky suits and shirts and ties. I've drank Wayne Gretzky wine.
And you're still here to talk about it?
But
Oh, really?
but I would never. I don't do the gambling. I hate that. I hate all the ads that come up when you're just trying to watch a game with your child. Children watching these things, drawn to these ads. It's not good. Bad for everybody.
That's right. And so
Yeah.
when Wayne Gretzky, somebody says to me, but Wayne Gretzky helped a little old lady across the road once and he gives to charity. Charity's a tax deduction for him. It's just buying him some good press. He's into gambling, he's promoting gambling, and I think that's disgusting and he should be taken off the ice. That's
Well,
it.
I still think January 26th should be a national holiday, but I don't like the sports gambling. All right, Paul.
There you are.
We're gonna
See
end
you
it there.
later.
We'll keep the Gretzky debate going. I think we that could be endless. All right, we're back next week. I might be back at the regular background, and so I hope everybody enjoys this the new format and everything about it. Give us your comments, give us your feedback, send us your breaking news, and we'll be back with you again next week. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Paul.
See you later.